Please take your seats so we continue. With the second panel discussion and also the final discussion of today. So apart from the topics being discussed in this discussion, I hope we just are able to sort of reassess various points that we have been discussing today and we didn't manage to have perhaps enough time for. So this panel discussion is called Institutional Critique, How to be Self-Critical in Biennial Work. It was interesting to hear from Bartholomew Marie his statement about blurring boundaries between museums and biennials and even art fairs. And in many ways I can agree with that. However, one could also argue that biennials, at least perhaps since the first Havana Biennial in 1984, have been designed as experimental platforms in opposition to museums. Since we are here in Berlin today, I'd like to also briefly remind the previous edition of the Berlin Biennial, the 7th edition, which was curated by an artist, Artur Żmijewski. It was mentioned already. As you might have learned, either by visiting or by reading about that edition, something was shaken. Business didn't go as usual, and I was thinking perhaps this is what we should be doing, ? Biennials can be improvised and heterotopic sites of dissidence. Biennials make a variety of unpredictable and transgressive effects possible, effects that exceed whatever brief its initiators may have scripted for. I keep my introduction very short because we have such great speakers and participants, but I'd like to briefly introduce Bige Orer as moderator of the next discussion. Bige has been working at the Istanbul Foundation for Culture and Arts, which is the institution in charge of the Istanbul Biennial, since 2003, and she's been the director of the Istanbul Biennial since 2008. Bige carries a lot of experience in the making of biennials, and I know that she and the Istanbul Biennial are extremely self-critical in their work. In fact, the idea for the topic of this discussion is hers. So I'd like to introduce Bige for her to introduce the others.
Thank you very much, Marieke, and thank you very much, Gabriele, and all the organizers of the conference. So welcome all to the final panel discussion of our conference. As the International Biennial Association, we are honored and happy to organize this panel with the esteemed curators, artists, art historians, and art professionals to contribute to the ongoing discussions about the biennials, and we will try to share our thoughts how to be self-critical in our biennial work and how we can develop further the institutional critique of the system in which we are acting. So the discussions and different opinions on biennials is not new. It dates back to the origins of the large-scale exhibitions. Biennials, as you may know, have been accused of being spectacles of neoliberal globalization and of promoting the interests of the city, the state, and of global interests. They have been criticized because of their funding structure, either public or private. There have been also issues of censorship and self-censorship. So these discussions do not only concern, of course, the biennials. These are the crucial questions, I think, which concern also the museums, the other art institutions, and the whole artistic system. So, but therefore, in this panel, we who are involved in planning and producing international scale exhibitions mostly share the idea that biennials have the potentials to provide a space for discussion and debate, as well as act as a form of experimentation and innovation, and also a catalyst for different layers of input in the city. It's important that the biennials are self-critical and try to engage with the different expectations of the local and international interests. Finally, I would like to read a quote from Alexander Dorner's visionary book, The Way Beyond Art, that the biennials of the 21st century should be in a state of permanent transformation, oscillate between object and process, be capable of multiple identities, be an active and fearless pioneer, promote a relative but not an absolute truth, be based on a dynamic concept of art history, be elastic, flexible displays within an adaptable building, and build bridges between artists and a variety of scientific disciplines. I also quote, "We cannot understand the forces which are effective in the visual production of today if we don't examine other fields of life." So today, we are happy to start with the presentation of Gita Kapur. As you may all know, she's a Delhi-based critic, curator, and an author. Her books include Contemporary Indian Artists, When Was Modernism, Essays on Contemporary Cultural Practice in India. And then following her presentation, we will be moving forward with Hedwig Fijen's, Ahmet Öğüt's, and Galit Eliat's presentations. We also have a special guest for our panel. So Carolyn Christov-Bakargiev kindly accepted our invitation to be present for this conference. As you know, we are working with her, and she's drafting the 14th Istanbul Biennial, which will be held in September 2015. And she has been the artistic director of the Documenta 13, which was held in 2012, the artistic director of the Sydney Biennale in 2008, and also she was involved with other international large-scale exhibitions. So it's inspiring to listen to her also, how she was engaged with the institutional critique throughout the making of international large-scale exhibitions. So as we have very limited time, now I would like to give the floor to Gita Kapur.
You'll forgive me, I decided to read this paper, and I hope that there's time for me to intervene in between and interpolate some of the issues that have come up in the morning. 3 quick takes. I have titled my presentation as "To Keep the Maverick Element Alive, Biennale as Exhibition, Institution, and Event." 3 quick takes into the discussion. Peter Berger, as we know, positioned the avant-garde against what he called art as institution. The debate around the spectacle, including mega events, understood by the situationists to be embedded in the capitalist superstructure, developed, as we again know, into institutional critique, conducted in systematic acts by artists and theorists since the 60s. The current slew of biennales provokes both passion and scorn. The latter, and I here might refer to the kind of position that the October group takes, for example, in relation to the Biennale phenomenon. The latter by those who see biennales distinct from the museum and the academy as crass spectacles of neoliberal globalization, complicit with vested interests of the city, of the state, and global corporates. The need for advocacy, dialogue, and disagreement of the Biennale as a rapidly expanding institution is self-evident. The vantage point from which this is conducted is not, however, self-evident. And I think some of the debate in the morning would lead up to that, including the first keynote address. I propose that the privilege and procedure of this discourse be less formally constituted, that the transitive and volatile character of new Biennale initiatives be kept alive, and even their maverick status. The Biennale is an event in the ordinary sense of the word, and also, of course, a spectacle. Predictably, therefore, it provokes institutional critique. If, however, we see it as an event, in inverted commas, in the way this is now theorized, and then educe a trope, the event appears as an eruption, both imminent and precipitate. It signifies rupture and a realignment of the ontological and ethical aspects of the political. The event can be seen as an embodiment, then, of a conjuncture, where the subject of history and the world come into a new structural relationship. then of an avant-gardist event such as the Biennale, minor as it is in its relation to the historical scale to which new theorizing of the event leads, should keep alive the tension between conjuncture and structure. Does the Biennale phenomenon require a supra-institutional form or a tiered succession of institutions that conduct generalized surveys, offer support, and formulate critique? Something like the Biennale Foundation, about which I'm beginning to know more recently, that critiques the global economy of culture, and its major publication, the Biennale Reader, published in 2010, is evidence, will be driven nevertheless by organizational ambitions to seek global funding of the very sources that are the subject of such critique. We have then to live constantly with these contradictions and ironies, and we'd have to take positions as we go along in making decisions about ethical and political decisions about which point at which we align and disalign from such kind of tiered institutional structures. Museums are long-established institutions, nowhere wanting to be dismantled. They require a CMAM. Association of Art Historians and Critics extend the discipline by placing the discourse in the public domain. Apropos of curatorship, it invites urgent discourse, of course, but not, it seems to me, as an academic protocol. High-profile curating advances a new form of power, and the status of the global curator, much valorized, needs to be deconstructed rather than consolidated, deconstructed down to the politics of practice, not consolidated into a meta-discourse with peer-driven institutional structures. And here I find myself contradicting a certain position I have taken at other times and even this morning, and I would like you to see this presentation as polemical, and I think polemics is not the greatest form of theorizing, but it has a value when one is actually dealing with contemporary phenomenon. In the morning session, in the panel discussion, I suggested that we should have thick discourse, or we should have as complex a discourse as we need around the Biennale phenomenon. What I'm probably questioning here, would like to question here, is some kind of a meta-discourse with peer-driven institutional structure, within peer-driven institutional structures. So I'm wondering whether, in fact, a foundation or an association which actually, where there are congregations of peers, if that is the best way in which the discourse of the Biennale might be staged. I go on to make a hypothetical proposition by taking three templates, and you're all familiar with them. The Venice Biennale as a classical conservative structure of world expositions, and in contradistinction, the Documenta as a post-war wager on a lost or fractured European avant-garde that advances this mandate each time anew. And third, the Sao Paulo Biennale, which not only emerged early in the chronology of biennales, but is located in a third world country with a very different and difficult history, brutal colonialism, an arduous process of decolonization, decades of dictatorship, and despite that, Brazil's distinctive modernity that includes a desire to sustain mixed cultures and to develop the economy through a left liberal socialism in great variation, of course, from decade to decade. I'm interested, of course, in Brazil from the point of view of an organization, BRICS, which is constituted of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and they're meeting right now in Brazil. And they pose, if merely only symbolically, resistance to the exigencies of empire. The symbolic element far exceeds the real resistance that one might expect or hope for from an organization like this. The three templates yield a vast outcrop: Havana, Asia-Pacific Triennale, Dakar, Istanbul, Gwangju, Sharjah, and 100 variations, jostling in a world which is unarguably surrendered to the expansionist regime of capital, yet not homogenized. The world remains inequitable in terms of material resources and ideologically fraught as between nations and people. The Biennale project must demonstrate precisely such steep differences. For that reason, a UN-type parliament of critic curators is both actually and metaphorically out of place. Even as each Biennale enters the global arena, we should look behind the spectacle and check for contradictions concealed in the wings, for it is here that the discourse is richest. I take the example of the Kochi Muziris Biennale in Kerala, India, the second edition of which comes up in December 2014. The Kochi Muziris Biennale was conceived to compact civilizational and contemporary history. Muziris, a port town in the Arabian Sea and in the far south of the Indian peninsula, functioned between 3rd century BC and 5th century AD. Trade routes included North African, Arabian, Mesopotamian, and Mediterranean lands, including parts of the Roman Empire. And in 1341, a deluge buried Muziris, and it becomes now an important archaeological site, providing an allegorical frame to the Biennale. Kochi supplanted Muziris as the major port to this region's spice trade. It harbored a multi-ethnic population, including races from across the Indian Ocean, and a multi-religious and communitarian ethos from the Buddhist, early Syrian Christian, and Islamic settlements, along with Hindu kings and colonial cosmopolitans, Portuguese, Dutch, and English. In post-independence India, Kerala installed the first democratically elected communist state government, which has remained there on and off since 1959, with legendary peasant leaders, almost 100% literacy in the state, and a radical intellectual culture. I think you might know why I'm putting this down. This is not in order to exoticize the place, but to actually locate the context in which the Biennale is taking place. KMB, Kochi Muziris Biennale, holds a brief for an international exposition with third world leanings. If you are looking for a form of alterity, Kerala is a good nodal point for a retroactive third world discourse developed by decolonized democracies with socialist agendas and anti-imperialist agendas, signaling a new worldview. For example, in Bandung, 1955, the Tricontinental Conference in 65, Afro-Asian and East European Solidarity Pacts, and much of what culminated in the rise of Cuba and the victory of Vietnam. Because the Biennale phenomenon, or the Biennales, have proliferated largely in the formal third world, or what we now call the South-South axis, this retroactive definition of alterity could still be important. In 2012, two artist curators, both Krishnamachari and Riyaz Komu, both from Kerala, supported by an improvised foundation and directorate, and backed by the left front government of Kerala, inaugurated the Kochi Muziris Biennale. It had precedence in the Indian Triennale, started in 1968 by a distinguished socialist writer, very much part of the Bandung ethos, and a chairperson of the National Academy of Art, and a putative artist-initiated Delhi Biennale envisioned in 2005 through 7, but never launched. Conditions at Kochi were very difficult when the process of installation started. Besides the paucity of infrastructure and funds, there were intestine battles between the state politicians and the bureaucracy, among ideologically honed artists, and so on. Despite or because of this, participating artists responded quite precisely to place history, to ecology, and to Kochi's cultural amalgam, and to the politics of the region. And a distinct aesthetic emerged. Spatially expansive, site-related archaeological, archival, and allegorical works, mnemonic works baiting historical temporality, works making a point through poor and lean materials in the mode of arte povera, and with, as it happened, Janice Cornelis and the much younger Ernesto Neto participating, contextual, conceptual, political, and discursive works, from Alfredo Jar to Santiago Serra, Ai Weiwei, etc. And a configuration of major as well as younger Indian artists who had never shown with such a site imaginary laid out before them in their own country. The Kochi Muziris Biennale resembled the Havana Biennale in the 1980s and 90s, a place where artists shed their hubris to participate in a collective effort and make meaning with the historically and culturally honed aesthetic. So while the Biennale run-up produced desperation, everyone waited and sweated and cooperated and forgave the Biennale organizers, with many ready to come out in a demonstration of support. But what now should be the future strategy of a Biennale like the Kochi Muziris? It is dependent on the state, both center and the province, corporate India, and the art community. A progressive conclave of artists, critics, curators, and an art elite, including sympathetic gallerists and collectors, but without the sound basis of a developed bourgeoisie and adequate institutional support for modern art. So while it should be our effort to give the recurrent exhibition or event and a viable status and some institutional stability, who should be the stakeholders in the project? When a new Biennale starts up in an unlikely nation space, where there's a weak or absent democracy, Sharjah, or military oppression by a neighboring state, Rivak Biennale in Palestine, a phalanx of enlightened representatives positioned on the high ground of Western art institutions are alerted. This can result in a boycott, necessary when the control is fascistic, as in the case of Israel over Palestine, or an expression of righteous disdain by the Western elite on account of the internal politics, internal state politics, and the interference in art matters, and if ideologies ensuing from cultural conditioning turn into censorship. And we have seen this, of course, across the world. Not only is the curator and the artist put into a state of urgent decision-making, but the phalanx of what I'm calling the large body of curators across the world come to the rescue of such a curator or Biennale. And whereas this would be very welcome when one is in a crisis, I'm questioning the space in which this support comes. Or, and this is more commendable, the curators from the other regions, from the West, go in as collaborating curators and artists to change and expand the mandate of art from within the given circumstances. Any change brought about in the troubled spot is the more valuable if it produces the confidence to not mimic privileged prerogatives of the liberal West, but instead calibrate, critique, and re-articulate these in ways that are radical for the place in question, but also for Western participants. Intervention requires that the empowered curators learn as much as they give about forms of control versus circumstantial anarchy while curating art making and dialoguing in such widely disparate conditions. Western democracies, in a compact with the new liberal dispensation, wherein state interests are complicit with global capital, continue to claim Enlightenment values and universal norms about the autonomy of art. I would argue for each Biennale fighting in its battle on the ground and making unpredictable moves in aesthetic and political terms from within the struggle. Rather than see the Biennales having successfully or ruefully globalized a place, city, nation, region, it is better to see it open up a field of contradictions and test forms of praxis available through art. My anti-foundational and conversely anti-neoliberal stance is both perverse and legitimate. India has just voted in May 2014, a right-wing government. We will now be dealing with a state committed to centralized control, reckless development via corporatization of people's resources, religious and ethnic majoritarianism that promotes fundamentalism. Culture and art will be subjected to harassed values, mean policies, and censorship, and these will be carried out in the parliament and by field activists with retrogressive, indeed pernicious agendas. While the Indian intelligentsia has been very largely left-wing or left-supporting, an influential percentage of the Indian middle class, amongst the largest in the world, despises socialism now, rejects state welfarism, is suspicious of NGO dissidents, mocks our secular history, and wants to redefine Indian culture as pure, hawkish, and techno-savvy, whereby it gains the corporate's confidence to globalize. The Euro-American ruling class and its leaders, including Madam Merkel, are more than eager to meet the authoritarian Mr. Modi to do urgent business. We will need support from global colleagues in pressing forward our progressive agendas of art in India. Yes, but not in the way of global scrutiny from the vantage point of liberal democracy. Democracy in its manifold avatars is exactly what each society must constantly redefine and fight for in a contemporary conjuncture. Since the elections, the Kochi Muziris Biennale spokespersons have already articulated the need for resistance to the new right-wing dispensation. The international community will gain by heeding such micro-shifts in the strategy and discourse of far-flung biennales. If you are to place curation in a transnational, transcultural public sphere, and whereas I do not use these terms very easily or very freely, I take the cue from, amongst others, from Okuyenvizer, who continues to push and problematize both contemporaneity and curation in the light of mid-20th century decolonization and today the emergence of empire. We must then stress difference, and not only in the shape of cultural markers as in identity politics, but at the level of society's deepest strata, its means and relations of production, its caste, class, and race equations, and its constitutional and extra-constitutional radicalism. Here, then, we will talk of artists' rights, which are not more precious than other citizens' rights, but will serve for us in the art world as clues to the structure of rights in civil, political, and juridical terms of our society, where it is not so easy to claim art's absolute autonomy. Battles need to be brought into the larger framework of democratic struggles and by a route that relates aesthetic and ethical values to forms of activism. A new paradigm for cultural activism involves a grueling pedagogy about how art intervenes to support democratic structures of governance, institutions for a functioning civil society, state bureaucracy, and the public sphere. While conceptual rigor and quality of artworks remains a prime priority, we also need a bestowal of faith and a period of nurturing, a struggle to keep the publics of art alive. KMB 2012 invited such publics or attracted such publics as to astound artists and elites from India and abroad. Kochi and the KMB put to the test the famous educational quotient of Kerala society. You saw many thousands of viewers reading every wall text with perfect diligence. Therefore, I am for wall text up to a point. And the nature of that pedagogy is important if we know how to actually make that communication possible. As if matching their own form of literacy to another, to a visual aesthetic with which they were not familiar, which they would have found coded, but were evidently engaged by. My argument ends here, to allow the Biennale format to be both maverick and contextual, that is to say, conjunctural, which means we conceive of the Biennale as an institution sprung from uncertainty, promise, and antinomies of the contemporary, but firmly hooked to the historical circumstance of its birth. The conjuncture produces discourse and poetics. It asks, on the other hand, for alertness towards emancipatory praxis in fields beyond art. By putting it thus, I reintroduce the concept of the avant-garde, premised on historical disjuncture and utopic concretion, that keep the interventionist energy alive in the soon-to-be institutionalized structure of every Biennale. Rather than construct the Biennale as an institutional juggernaut, one tier upon another, the Biennale foundation, forum, association included, so that we build one tier after another, which is extremely useful in a pure context, but may have problems in the larger issues of locating the politics in the place where it belongs. Rather than construct an institutional juggernaut to be established to be demolished dutifully by dispassionate scrutiny, why not choose from the start a trope that yields anarchic dissensus? why not situate the Biennale in the public domain, understood by the very logic of global politics to be not so convivial as agonistic? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Geeta, for this inspiring talk. In fact, I have many questions, but I will try to ask only one question after each talk, because then in order to save some time for the final discussions. So it was really interesting for me to hear from you about the potential of the biennials to unfold the privileged prerogatives of the global West, but instead calibrate, critique, and re-articulate these points in ways that are radical for the place in question, but also for Western participants. Could you please evaluate further on this issue?
I'm not only speaking of this hypothetically. I know it to be a fact that the best curators do that they go into a field. I mean, Galit just mentioned, and this would have been true of many curators, that they would have been in the place for a year before the Biennale opens and would be involved not in just research on art, but actually the structures of society, the nature of civil society, the position of art within it, and projects for pedagogy, which I think I'm right in knowing that Sao Paulo has been a great pioneer in pedagogy, and I've heard Herkenhoff speak about it and so on. So that the best curators do that. But I'm suggesting that there is a kind of traveling curator. So let us say a genre has been formed where there is a certain kind of iteration of a template which has thematically a difference every time, thematized differently, projected differently, but which in actual fact does not engage in the manner in which the particular context requires. And I'm not talking of context in some sociological sense, but precisely in terms of a political conjuncture at that moment. So, for instance, if I may say so, when the great crisis occurred in Sharjah with Jacques Persekian, I found it from India very difficult to make an absolutely clear-cut judgment on how to proceed. Whereas it was very clear that it was not the right thing done to Jacques Persekian. I understood that in India this would have been very, very difficult to negotiate. So that I was particularly resentful when there was a campaign of international curators to support this position, where in fact, if I know better, I mean if I know rightly, Jacques Persekian did not take that position. He kept himself very, very carefully in relationship to the context to which he belonged, without obviously surrendering his whatever curatorial autonomy would be part of his framework. So I would suggest that in such cases, the Enlightenment values of the West are not what we are actually looking for. We are looking for an understanding of the politics of the place and finding a radicality from within it.
Thank you, Geeta. So we will continue with Hedwig's talk. As you may all know, Hedwig has acted as the director of Manifesta, the European Biennial of Contemporary Art, since its founding in Rotterdam in the early 90s. And she is in charge of all aspects of the Manifesta organization, including the selection of host cities, thematic content, the curatorial selection, and the final execution of the curatorial concept. So, as you also all know, Manifesta 10 opened just last week in St. Petersburg, which was also the subject of many heated discussions in the last months. So, Hedwig,
thank you, Geeta. Thank you so much. I'm not here alone representing Manifesta 10. Also, Kasper Koenig, the curator of Manifesta 10, is here, and Maria Iserles, our Ukraine general coordinator from St. Petersburg. We indeed just arrived from St. Petersburg, and I have elaborated a little bit a large lecture, but I will cut it down on institutional critique from the point of view from Manifesta, because as most of you know, it was not only Manifesta 10 which was criticized and had many calls for boycotts, but also Manifesta 6 was even cancelled in Nicosia. Since I have to cut down, I'm not going to speak about the past, but I speak about the present, and specifically about to share some of our dilemmas which we were facing during the development of the 10th edition of Manifesta 10 in St. Petersburg from a political, economical, and social cultural perspective. But I'm also asked here to elaborate upon how specifically nomadic biennials Manifesta can act productively in so-called contested areas, and how Manifesta deals with the issue of institutional critique and the boycotts we have faced specifically the last 2 years. So I'm now skipping a long part. Since 2010, we are working on the selection, so already 4 years, on the selection of the location of the Manifesta Decade Show. And since 2012, we work towards the Biennial in the State Hermitage Museum on the occasion of the 250th anniversary of the museum and the 20th anniversary of Manifesta. For 125 days, next to the biennial program, the city of St. Petersburg is hosting contemporary art within more than 56 collateral projects in the city. The institutional critique on hosting Manifesta 10 in Russia in 2014 and the many calls for boycotts came from different sides. This brings us to the question how biennials are able to deal with boycotts and use it in a productive way and possibly deal with it. As you know, both from the art system itself, from the international LGTB movement, and by opinion makers in the international media, Manifesta was attacked for her presence in Russia. First, important to know that Manifesta took the decision of hosting an edition in Russia not lightly and naively. Before making this decision of organizing Manifesta in Russia, we investigated already in 2010 thoroughly the local political and cultural situation by analyzing the need and the urge to be present, for example, through our channels of our president, Russian critic and writer Victor Misiano, and also by aligning with NGOs, consulate, grassroots activist groups such as the LGTB movement in both Russia, Europe, but also in the Netherlands. The Russian gay and lesbian group Coming Out in St. Petersburg, who stated that the presence of Manifesta at this moment rightly is needed, said, quote open, "We at Coming Out are very grateful for any kind of international support to the LGTB citizens in Russia, as it is important that people do not feel further isolated in the current climate of repression, homophobic aggression, and intimidation. We do understand the call for boycott for events like Manifesta, but we truly believe it's important to keep all channels open and enable all possible communication, to challenge human rights violations at every opportunity, whether they are culture, sports, business, or political campaigns," quotes closed. Hosting a Manifesta edition in the State Hermitage and the city of St. Petersburg without accepting any censorship or self-censorship was part of the discussion, specifically Kasper, had with Michael Petrovsky, the director of the Hermitage, who was our strongest ally and who till the very end defended the presence of Manifesta in his museum as an intervention, following a long tradition of 250 years, starting with Catherine the Great. Petrovsky defended Manifesta's presence and the freedom of artistic voices in the museum, stating that the museum is not the Kremlin, and showing contemporary art falls into this long tradition. In the Manifesta projects which were discussed by Casper Koenig and his team, no projects were cancelled because of the political content or political statements, just because of technical, spatial, time-based, other logistic or economical reasons. 3 artists accepted and declined the invitation by Koenig. And the challenge of hosting a contemporary art biennial in a Byzantine institute as the Hermitage was foremost also a matter of facing an institutional structure which is unknown with contemporary art practices, and as Kasper said constantly, niet, 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 and dealing with incredible bureaucratic decision-making structure, financial incapacities. The institutional critique on Manifesta 10 came mostly from the international outside world. The 2013 call for boycott for Manifesta by Irish artist Kelly followed a Russian petition which asked for support to keep Manifesta 10 in St. Petersburg. And after the decline of the invitation by St. Petersburg activist group Eilat, only 2 other artists followed their request. And it's because of most of the Manifesta artists who, despite all logistic difficulties, stuck with us and never gave up, we were able to open last week. 35 artists were commissioned new works and did site-specific research with our international and Russian team of producers. And in this context, because I mentioned specifically the artist, I would like to use a quote here by the artist Thomas Hirschhorn in regard to the many calls for boycott and how artists reacted. Open quote. Thomas Hirschhorn: "I'm not against boycotting in principle. I did boycotts and I still do. But something I know is if you do a boycott, you have to be the first one, who pays the price for doing the boycott. Only if you pay the price for pronouncing a boycott, it makes sense, and the boycott will be efficient. Whenever you do a boycott without having to pay a price to do so, your boycott is only opportunism and in the end a failure." Quote closed. As everyone must have observed in the international media, none of us expected to end up in the annus horribilis of the year 2014, which was characterized by many different calls of boycott, as I mentioned, because of the introduction, for example, by the homophobic new laws in 2013, but also by the Crimea annexation and the recent civil war in the eastern part of Ukraine, which UK Foreign Secretary William Hague prompted to call the biggest crisis facing Europe in the 21st century. In this context, Manifesta 10 had to survive last 2 years in a so-called Shakespearean dilemma. Should we go or should we stay? Should we leave Russia or should we just stay now when our presence is most needed? And the question how to engage or disengage is not only Manifesta, occupying Manifesta 2, but as we heard today, many other biennials around this world. We, the Russian and international team of Manifesta, the artists and curator majority think and thought we should right now be in Russia and respond to the conflicts of our time and the complexities of this specific situation. And for the second time only in our history, the biennial did not take place in the safe haven of the West, but took upon the challenge of confronting the critical contemporary art and the ideas of our time with the collection of the Hermitage and the Russian complex context at large. We are and we were conscious that this engagement to stay in St. Petersburg is one of those moments when art is really needed, if it wants to engage with the complexities and act in a context-responsive way. Not only in a defensive way, but in a proactive way in supporting these groups in Russian community who need our moral and political support. Especially in this time frame, one should not set people and our audiences equal to their governments. To work in a specific 125 days, context-responsive and critical way is our Manifesta 10 public program curator Joanna Warswa, who developed an extensive public program, which together with the education program of Sepaka Angiame, is to intervene in the city of St. Petersburg, its social, cultural, and historical complexity, a city which is characterized by its embedded Europeanness. I was supposed to show now a video with the text of Joanna Warswa, but I think it's too long. So just read a small text. Joanna said, the Manifesta public program integrating most artistic projects from artists from former Soviet countries who in an interdisciplinary way directly invade the public spaces of the city of St. Petersburg, like parks, stations, like the Vitebsk station and a former communal apartment. I wanted to give some examples of, I'm going through it right now, some examples, but maybe we can discuss this later, since this lack of time. Referring to the question of this panel, how to be self-critical in a biennial context, the main challenges of Manifesta 10, in terms of staging the necessary critical debate in St. Petersburg, was the question of how to become relevant in a complex political structure, and how to engage with the complexities it wants to influence. What became clear in all preliminary discussions with critical parties following Manifesta 10 was the ability or disability of Manifesta 10 to create those actions which led to staging active platforms for discussion, and second, to operate as a mediator contributing to education and new pedagogical formats. Both was given attention to and is in the core of the Manifesta as an institution. The general institutional critique that Manifesta was never able to engage with a real local audience in the broadest sense has been solidly counterbalanced by previous editions, which were, for example, 70% visited by local and regional visitors. Cuauhtémoc's Manifesta 9, 1 out of 4 local Genk people visited the biennial, and more than 37% took part in education. The critique that Manifesta caters only to career curators and the institution is firmly denied by us and proved by figures and audience reviews. Criticism that Manifesta 10 taking place in the Hermitage is not mobilizing those groups open for critical thinking and resistance, be it that the biennial is only visited by cruise ship nationalistic Russian audiences. Those who claim this have not studied our differentiated education and public program, of which a majority is taking place outside Hermitage, but in the city itself, in the public domain and public venues. Let me give some examples of our education program. We have the Manifesta TV as an educational TV channel based on critical interrogation by young Russian journalists in St. Petersburg, questioning the Biennale, its functioning and its impact for St. Petersburg, being broadcasted on the YouTube channel. The Manifesta 10 mediation education program is developed together with more than 100 local St. Petersburg schools and 14,000 students which actively anticipate their visit to Manifesta 10 and for the first time have their own creative spaces built in the Hermitage General Staff Building to discuss what they have experienced. The differentiated program of education in the biennial is not only focused on the regular individual and family guided tours, but also more on professional training in the projects like, for example, the Manifesta Discursive program, Manifesta Daja, on the Manifesta on Board, a ship where 300 curators from different regional Nordic countries participating in a Manifesta 10 summer school, all taking place in the summer of 2014 in the region of Leningrad. Next to this, worth mentioning are also our Russian translation programs, which have been staged as working on translation of curatorial books and curatorial articles from the last series, for example, of the Manifesta Journal into Russian in collaboration with the curatorial school, Smolny, Bard College, and Calvert Foundation. Second, we are always asked how we are able to prove social engagement with those groups in Russian society who are stigmatized and might need support to open up the discussion with communities of resistance. This is done not only in supporting the Coming Out conference in September this year, where the LGTB movement interacts with Manifesta 10, but also in active support to M10 local collateral events composed of the more than 56 artistic projects from both St. Petersburg and the entire Russia, which are crucial important since these projects are not simply balancing out the criticality of Manifesta itself, but create a powerful context of engagement, research, freedom of voices, and possibly without the presence of Manifesta, not able to develop. These parallel events were selected by an independent jury of both Russian and international colleagues. And in this unique case, and because it was needed, Manifesta was able to co-finance a part of these local artistic practices as part of the collateral projects. The larger impact of these projects should be identified only long after the closure of the biennial at the end of maybe even 2050. And in this context, it's worth to mention we are working in collaboration with the School of Economics of the Free European University of St. Petersburg, developing a public review in which an analysis is made of how Manifesta the Biennial has functioned for a Russian audience in terms of mediating the content and reaching out to a larger audience and starting discourse in schools. In the context of how productive a biennial can deal with institutional critique or self-criticality, an example is that we have commissioned David Riv as a guest editor of the Manifesta Journal number 18 to develop one special edition in the realm of Manifesta 10, dealing with the current changing and diffusive role of censorship at large in the international biennials. And of course, we know that the big elephant in the room is Manifesta itself. If we analyze the question of this panel, can we imagine a biennial as a space to support the right of freedom of expression, or using biennial as an instrument for opening up culture debate? They're two essential issues which I experience in the context of biennials such as Manifesta, which I would like to refer to. The element of timing is essential in using the biennial as a platform for debating and social interaction. The biennial should insist to have the flexible allowance for organization, artists and curators to invest more time for research and the ability to create an embedding of the program in the existing culture and political infrastructure. We can all conclude that most of the time 2 years intervals is not enough for a more sustainable embedding and a deep understanding of the political structure in which the biennial need to operate. Since Manifesta is anticipating the selection of its host venues now for up to 4 to 6 years in advance, we hope to give more time for studying the local social structures and hope to involve the curators in the biennial program and to create a more sustainable context in which they can investigate their curatorial research. Limitations in time frame create immediately effects on all levels of curatorships. The second element is funding, of course. It was said before today. The economical context and financial sources of biennials become decisive in how to morally operate and how to navigate between the demands of the private and the public sector. In case of local corporate, public and semi-public funding, like in Manifesta, how does a biennial like this deal with possible manipulation of the local public funding bodies, and how can Manifesta still operate as a parasite invading and criticizing this system, while we know at the same time being part of the same neoliberal system itself? It's a question that is not easy to solve. And it's an illusion to think that biennials can act completely autonomous and become completely self-sufficient, independently operating for any public or private body. Balancing between the misusing of the biennial as a parasite infiltrating the local system and the same time being instrumentalized by the same system is a standard critical approach of biennials now these days. And also in Manifesta, we're guilty. The strong combination of a claim to societal and artistic relevance with a claim to so-called autonomy appears to be maybe untenable in the long term, or even maybe it has already past its expiration date. Let me finish with a quote of Marlene Dumas from her great famous Men series. In the Manifesta 10 exhibition, she's quoting James Baldwin, who said, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's really faced." Thank you.
Thank you, Hedwig. I would like to ask you, as you have been, directing Manifesta for such a long time, and as you have been working with many curators throughout this period, how do you see your role in relation to the curators you are working with? And, what are the main challenges for?
Well, I think I already elaborated a little bit on this. I'm not a curator. I'm the person who creates the context in which curators and the team can work, and we create the parameters of possible structures. What I already said is that I'm faced mostly, and this is of course also in the last Manifesta was a very critical part of our complete structure, was the funding itself, but also like the time frame in which we operate, not only to be able to do research, but also the not being completely autonomous and being independent, but in the context, working in the context of the State Hermitage Museum. As we know, Manifesta was always in crisis. Manifesta is not a body which has a continuous safe place somewhere in a city structure, as most of the biennials worldwide. So we need to reinvent really the structure of the biennial every 2 years. And this makes also that Manifesta has a permanent structure which is not funded by any kind of government, not even by by the European Commission, that it needs to reinvent these structures also every 2 years. And this makes the complexity and the continuity and the sustainability of our programs really always in a kind of a crisis situation. And I think it was only by the support we got from so many sides after the collapse of Manifesta 6, that we were able to create a continuity. And this is why, with the very small sustainability we have in our organization, we hope to create structures which are giving Manifesta a little bit more of time. So this is why, what I already said, the selection of host cities is anticipated far in advance. But this might be the same even for those biennials who are not roving and nomadic, that the intervals of the timing of every 2 years is almost impossible. Because even if what this morning was said, we have time for production, it's not really true, because you hardly have time to digest the situation which we are in. And this is exactly what we need at this moment, that we should have time to analyze the lessons we learned in being in Russia. We should analyze the situation we're in. We should maybe even, as Manifesta did in the past, organize meetings with several professionals from the past Manifestas, how to continue and how to maybe get out of this crisis.
Thank you, Hedwig. Now I'm really happy to introduce you Ahmet Öğüt, who is a dear friend of mine, with whom we are collaborating since 2005. We started working together for the 9th Istanbul Biennial, which was realized in 2005 and curated by Vasıf Kortun and Charles Esche. And then Ahmet is not only an artist, but he's also a negotiator, a lecturer, and socio-cultural initiator. So he has been invited, he has participated in many international large-scale exhibitions, and he has also had many solo exhibitions all around the world. And we thought that his participation is really crucial because he took part in all these discussions in the previous Sydney Biennial, which was held in March 2014. And as you may remember, there were many discussions about the sponsor, the main sponsor of the Sydney Biennial, and about Transfield and how artists reacted to this funding relationship. And Ahmet was also one of the participating artists in the Sydney Biennial, and he took the responsibility of responding to this context. So now I give the floor to Ahmet.
Thanks, Bige. Thanks, everybody. First thing first, I need to cover this first. Not because I care so much, because there was another talk a few weeks ago. There was a question, so we need to use the time properly, so we focus on the issues. Very limited time. It's very difficult to put in one presentation the whole process, what happened in Sydney. It's actually, we have to go 40 years back, and also the effects will be many years. And also, if there was time, I would love to talk about the case of Istanbul Biennial also much. But even more important than those case studies, there are tools that we can use, so I listed those tools, so there should be some time to talk about those. So I will try my best. So let's give 5 minutes chronologically what happened in Sydney. So I start with question. After many years of practice as artists or as institutions, as institution directors, the word of consciousness is very important. And then this other question, how art institutions face with social and ethical responsibilities towards their public, their collaborators, art workers, artists, when it comes to source of their finances. So I will get back to that question. So for the ones who don't know chronologically what happened in Sydney, I will do very, very quick and brief intro of what happened. Basically, well, we were invited 2013. I was invited 2013 August, a year ago, from now, almost a year ago, and we find out about these issues end of January, approximately 1.5 months before the Biennial was about to open. So in 1973, the Biennial was founded by Transfield. Transfield was a family company, and later became 3 different companies, more corporate company. And this Transfield holding is still financing the Biennial 8%. And we get back to Transfield. Well, they did an agreement end of January with government to run 2 detention camps, offshore detention camps. It's a very big agreement for next 20 months, 1.22 billion. And that was right before, like shortly before the Biennial was about to open. And what is the mandatory asylum seeker mandatory detention policy that goes back to 1992, and it's controversial to 1951 UN Refugee Convention. Basically, anyone trying to enter Australia without a valid visa could be detained indefinitely the rest of their life. So it's up to government to decide if that person should go and should stay. And during this, when we just find out, only 2 weeks after, there was a big clash in one of the detention camp, and a series 77 asylum seekers, supposed to be asylum seekers officially, people held in the camp. They were seriously injured, and there was one casualty. And what happened, which is we don't witness so often, thousands of Australians went to the streets demonstrating in many different Australian cities. So that was parallel to what is happening with the conversation, the Biennial. And I go back to what happened to us. Like we find out, like I was invited a year ago, and 4th of February, there was an article published by an academician. And it was sent to me by an artist friend from Australia. And only a few days after Biennial itself, they sent a Q&A, a kind of misleading Q&A, all the artists, with a kind of little bit of misinformation as well, that this is not the same company, it's another company take care of detention camps. That is actually not the offshore, but there's another big company. And they later say that that was misleading. They accepted. Well, when that happened, we started talking to each other. So, and around 46 artists. I mean, I'll get back to this also later. What is the difference? We really have to pay attention to certain things. What's the difference between the word withdrawal, boycott? Everybody just used the word boycott, or protest, or propaganda. Maybe there will be a question coming later, or campaign. A big fundamental difference between those words. And the acts, being not responsible and acting from completely outside, or being part of something and try to act within, and at some point maybe decide not to be within. So we just sent a letter to start the negotiation, basically. 46 artists, and originally the plan was the 46 artists, they were all planning to do protests. They were not all planning to withdraw, they were all planning to protest, and none of those protests happened because there was other developments just before the Biennial opened. So anyway, after our letter, that's still normal. We write a letter, we are concerned, we disagree politically and so on. There was this kind of answer. We always don't pay attention also to the statements and answers made by such huge, large-scale institutions. Either they're sometimes very quickly made, or they are done by us, like somebody else, somebody from PR department, or maybe even the sponsor themselves, they do the statement. It's a bit unknown. In this case, even the curator of the Biennial admit that it's like none of the words in that first statement, it was hers. So one little sentence in the statement made it clear, especially to me. Without the Transfield, the Biennial would not even exist. That is providing right now 6% of the budget. And artists must make a decision according to their own understanding and beliefs. So this is really, really putting artists to another position, and it's also a message that, you know, if some of you go on, we have still enough artists. Like, we are sure we will have enough artists, and we can still do the show. It was a statement like that. So it's really underestimating even the you know, opinion of the artist. So what happened that some of us maybe took this as an offending answer and no space for a dialogue, and 5 of us withdrew. But it was also following like technicians, some of the technicians, one graphic designer, quite a few volunteers, they all withdrew. And a few other artists followed us. So all happening in a few days. It's different to talk about things like that afterwards. It's almost like a history. You talk about history. But when you talk about the moment it's happening, it's like an intervention. Like, it was also a statement from us, and then a statement from the institution. So it was not this informal email between the institution or the curator and the artist. There was also a lot of them. But we try to make it clear what we think, and we try to make it known by the public. So there was quite a, like, the incredible thing that all happened in very, very short time, in only a few weeks. But it was such an issue, and such a clear issue to many of us. And some got confused, some didn't know how to react, but quite many of us knew how to react, at least. So there was quite many effects, and it turned into a campaign, because outside there was a call for boycott that's independent than our act, and we were even the first target, not the institution. They sent individual emails to artists like, you have to withdraw, boycott the Biennial, and this was, I think, also wrong way of informing the artist, not like immediately targeting, instead of just informing, look, there's something going on, you should maybe consider thinking about it. Instead of that, like, really straightforward targeting to private emails. Well, anyway, so what happened, the issue was such a big issue, and parallelly it was like a big topic to discuss what happened in the camp at the same time. It went to the parliament as well. So there was Green Party Senator Lee Rhiannon moving forward a motion in support of us. She got only support of 8 other members. Because Australian Parliament decided it's mandatory detention, and they still stand behind it. And during those weeks when we withdrew, maybe it's directly linked or not, but the company's image damage, and they also lost a lot of money, 9% during the campaign. Their shares dropped. When they signed the agreement just a few weeks before with the government, their share went up 21%, I think. So halfway it dropped. So it went on and on. They would probably lose that other part as well. And many people, we do sign petitions supporting of this kind of demands. But it was very important to have a clear act from within, because some of our friends, they thought they need time, but we didn't have time. Like, when you don't have time and you think you need time, what would you do? Like, you just have to take a decision. I think the most dangerous is like taking no decision. Like, they wanted to go and see the situation. We just basically didn't have time for that. International media and local media is always different. Local media was absolutely attacking on us or any kind of criticism, and it's very clear they are controlled by whom. But international media is not under the same situation, so it was very important that it was equally discussed in international media. And other sponsors also start being concerned, because they are supporting really, they are giving big support. Same amount of support comes from City of Sydney. They had a big concern about what's going on. It's a big statement that if Transfield goes, the Biennial ends. So there was other serious professional concern. It was discussed in ZKM and other places, and there was a discussion between curators internally, like it was an issue urgently discussed as well. So what happened just, I think 2 weeks before, shortly before the Biennial opens, chairman and Transfield, they cut the ties with the Biennial. He resigned. Well, that did several things. So all this other protest was supposed to happen. I mean, these other outside groups, they were really trying to stop the ferries going to the main biennial venue. There was like major plans not to have a peaceful opening week. But also this other 46 protests didn't happen, which is good. So what happened after that? It made it clear actually where we stand. We were not boycotting because we already accepted to take part in the biennial. What we did, we demanded that or demand somehow happened, and our position should be, well, at least what I thought and 6 others, because we were 9 who withdrew, except 2 of us, we thought it's our biennial. It's not like somebody else's biennial. It's our biennial, and we have to reclaim it, and we have to go there. We have to meet all together. We can join forces with the organization itself and other artists who were on the side or we were taking part. Doesn't matter. We can really all together discuss the alternatives, because we need to find alternatives, right? One sponsor is gone, and that's like really not just a single sponsor. They're supporting Opera House Theatre. They're like one of the biggest supporters of culture in Australia. And their father founded the Biennial as well. So that was the idea, but we went and it was a peaceful opening week. No one wanted to discuss the issues, but we had a great chance to really take it further even, but that didn't happen. Maybe we need, well, I saw that then we need maybe time to understand what are the consequences. Okay, Sydney is over for now. After all these experiences, I mean, we had also just before Sydney in Istanbul, after the uprising, only 3 months after that, there was Biennial's opening, and many decisions changed after the moments of, unexpected big social movement and a lot of things dramatically changing in the country. Biennial had to change its structure and plans eventually. So Istanbul also had a very different kind, but a situation like this. So I kind of experienced just by being from there and by working with the Biennial 2 times before. So thinking about all these issues, we just don't run away, like we are part of it. Like we really, really need to think about it. I don't know how many minutes I have, but I should talk about this. So what is the position of artists? Collective act is very important. When you act alone, that doesn't have a serious enough impact, because there are always many other artists. So we had, I think, almost half of the artists signing that letter. It was very important altogether, and that was the first public move. Otherwise, artists are really fragile, and really, especially when they're acting alone, and they could be easy targets, and there are a lot of personal consequences. Demand, I think, instead of focusing on words of boycott or other protest, we should focus on demand, and when necessary, withdrawal. Like we should always have that in the pocket, that option. Hopefully it's not necessary, but when it's necessary, it should be done. That means that there's no more space for dialogue. And demand is always about this constructive act and antagonistic dialogue. It has to be antagonistic and progressive anyway. Negotiation. Yeah, negotiation should be itself a modality. So we should not stuck with the discussion, yes or no, should we engage or not engage. This is all kind of discussion. I think we should more focus on the different shades of negotiation, how it could be done. Like we should maybe learn from some people from outside of art world. And right to act beyond the body of work. Usually artists also themselves, they think this is none of their business, or they resolve these issues within their practice. Well, I think everything around our practice is part of our practice, and right to act beyond the body of work is just a natural thing. It's not like some political artists taking the decisions and others don't think it's their responsibility. Among the 9 artists who withdrew, some of them, they were not really doing like claimed or even represent themselves as political artists. They just felt uncomfortable. And they had pain in their brain, in their hearts. We all had that pain, and we didn't know how to deal with that pain in such a short time. let's go back to institutions and biennials itself. So there was, I think, a lot of learning experience for all of us, observing these events happening and sometimes being part of it, sometimes from outside. Credibility and trust is very important. We should not confuse that with the festivalism or number of visitors, branding, and this kind of more neoliberal capitalist system, like this is the typical criticism. But really, still, we have to, if we want to keep the biennials alive, we have to see them as pedagogic sites, and they have to be transformative. Every time they should have a statement, and they should even propose a new modality. And especially, like, without public or without a political autonomy, we won't have those things happening. So prioritizing this very important, not the profit, and the others, or then start making ethical compromises, like it's becoming so visible. So it has to act in between, like without compromise, or step by step how we can have the progress. Sponsorship is not ownership. You can see many things I listed there. That is another big mistake in Sydney. Like, sponsorship became ownership because it was a family founded the Biennial like 40 years ago. We should not confuse that. Sydney Biennial, by the name, it is cultural heritage. It was very important when it was established because there was no access to international art. That was the reason it was established and bring in the artists, because people cannot travel outside. So it's very important not to mix cultural heritage and ownership and sponsorship. Yeah, I mean, this institutional elitism, it's being discussed all the time. Yeah, diplomatic solutions, like we talk about them, but how many of them we can achieve, these are important. Well, many things. Let's continue. Reclaiming public space. I mean, this locally, thinking the biennials locally is important, especially like if you think of case of Istanbul. I think reclaiming public space is the most urgent thing right now. It's very different elsewhere. Like in Manifesta's case, I think use of surplus is was the maybe most urgent thing to activate in order to affect the laws and so on. Finishing. Okay. A minute left. Okay, well, we will have some. Okay, unbelievable. Unbelievable. Okay, transparency, decision making. Decision making is also very important. Like making decisions about financial agreements and making conceptual decisions. These are not two separate processes. We should definitely think together. And consequences. When an event like the case of Sydney, for instance, there were some people talking, oh, you see, Australian government cut the art funds, you see, that's the effect of what you did. You know, these are short-term consequences. We have to think. Maybe that was the end of 40 years of structure of sponsorship. Maybe it has to be re-established in a different way. I mean, maybe we are even too late to reconsider and think about how it could be established in a different way. Like it was very different in Holland when there was government money was cut. Then people had to invent the ways of how to collaborate because they were maybe institutions, they didn't need that before. Okay, so approach. Finishing, parasite and target practice. That's Jana Graham's presentation. If you ever come across, you should, like, I strongly recommend. And she usually talks from the perspective of someone working within a big institution and try to create a more rather autonomous and really a different kind of way of working with the communities and the neighborhoods, and it's a very challenging one. So I want to bring that theory to the discussion to the biennials, parasitic approach and target practice. Okay, no time for that. Yeah, target practice is the typical one using banking concept, and I just have to jump this. And parasitic approach is the other one, like problem posing concept. So I take it from this pedagogy of the oppressed, and Jana takes it to the institutional critic, and I'm taking to maybe now to the biennial discussion. And when maybe it will come back last thing. Okay, I was thinking it's a straight line, but when watching again the work of Hito Steil about last Istanbul Biennial, when she showed that lecture, performative lecture, she says she didn't know what to do, but she basically, it is hidden within her work, not as an act she took, but the theory is there, reversing the loop of circulation of structural contradiction. So it's not about where the money comes from, who is the sponsor, and so on. It's a circle. Maybe it goes this way. We just have to reverse it this way. Thank you.
Just wondering, you know, after the resignation of the CEO of the Biennial, did you see this action as a success or not? Because he didn't really cut his ties with the company which is building detention centers, but just the sponsorship of the Biennial was cut. And also, I remember the CEO of the Biennial, Mara Brahe, making this statement about, you know, the Sydney Biennial also gets approximately 15 or 16% of public funding, and I mean, it will still continue taking this funding when you also decided to present your works, you know, after this crisis situation. The Biennial still had this funding, which was also problematic because this is the Australian government which has this detention center policy. So what were your thoughts?
Well, then we should actually withdraw from the citizenships, right? That could be the cleanest limit. I think it was a success, and it was an absolute success. But we have to look at it carefully, because at least he understood he had to take a decision between profit making and culture, supporting culture, because supporting culture brings a lot of important surplus to the company itself, to their family, and many other things. And this is nothing to underestimate. Maybe this is not with the numbers, but we should see the power of this surplus, like why Istanbul Biennial has maybe like such an important surplus value. I don't say branding, like maybe the way Guggenheim used it is more like using the power of the brand, but how we can use it more, how we can democratize it, as David Harvey says, I quoted that, or it comes from this Henry Lefebvre's Right to the City and other things. This surplus is very important, how it's operated. So he made a clear decision. He's not on the side of culture, he's on the side of profit. Maybe there was a lot of other issues, maybe a lot of losing money involved, a lot of other things involved, but absolutely he came to the point that before he probably never ever thought of he had to take a decision between one of those. And when a moment like that, one has to take a decision. And at least that was the one very clear thing. And of course, a lot of other things. The money was already used for the Biennial, and there are a lot of contradictions. For instance, even opposing the curatorial concept, I relocated my work last 5 days, find a way to produce it, and using luckily there was international support for it, so we could still produce the work and place it elsewhere. And these are important things, because I felt still uncomfortable. I can't expect the whole Biennial get rid of this one Biennial location because it is owned by, like, the president is the other brother of who resigned and so on. I don't want to be maybe connected with that. If I find a practical solution for that, I find it, and I was like, have to find it. We could even, as artists, we could even not return. If thinking about contradiction, and easier, we had support of 2 academies. Academies were behind us, and they had also their own museums, galleries within the campuses, and their production team was ready for us. Even the graphic designer of Vitru wanted to design our alternative catalog. It was all like sophisticatedly ready, without not really having any budget or anything, to be publish an alternative publication, make an alternative show elsewhere. But for us, after a result like that, why do we stay outside? It's actually time to just go back and engage together with the organization. Because organization also is fragile. like Biennial
exactly.
is also Friday.
Yeah, I think it's a historical case study to be also perceived further in the future. Maybe we are able to understand a part of it now, but we will be able to understand how it develops and how the Sydney Biennial as an institution responds to all this criticality. So hopefully we will continue our discussion in the final round. Now I would like to introduce Galit Eilat, who is an independent curator, writer, and the founding director of the Israeli Center for Digital Art in Holon. And she is working as the co-curator of the 31st Sao Paulo Biennial, which will be opening in September this year. And she was also the co-founder and chief editor of Marav, an online arts and culture magazine. And she also a research curator at the Van Abbe Museum. So I leave the floor to Galit.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation to all the people behind this operation. I asked to give critical reading or to show the critical approach of Biennial that will be open in less than 2 months. I find it quite difficult. So I will try to present the way, the tools that we are using, and not to do too much propaganda for the Biennial, because this is the time, I think, for propaganda with some criticality. So I will try. I will try first to describe a bit the history, to do it very quickly, like 5 minutes and less, of Sao Paulo Biennial. I think it's quite important to put it in right context. But before, we are 5 curators and 2 associate curators working together, sharing the works, the lot of the works. Each one of us take part of the responsibility, and we are supporting each other. So there is no chief curator. We are all or curator or co-curators. Nuria, Angita Mayo, that's sitting over here with me, Pablo Lafuente, Charles Esche, Oren Sagiv, the associate curator Benjamin Sarusi, and Luisa Purense. One of the complaints that the curatorial team is growing all the time. The way that we work is horizontal, and also we are, maybe I will use a microphone. Thank you, I will be more free. The way that we work, the Sao Paulo Biennial, this is something that we didn't discuss before, but there are 2 fundamental difference between biennials. One that has an institute which is all due, it's a biennial, that it's there all the time with the team, with the effort, working for 2 years. And other that an institute, that the biennial, it's a parasite or parallel program. It's 2 fundamental organizations. The Sao Paulo Biennale has its own team and education department, which is institute inside the institute. It's founded 4 years ago. To the Sao Paulo Biennial, I think the last one arrived around the amount of visitors, it's 500,000. Half of them are coming from schools, half of them related to the education program. In the education program, every day, around between 20 to 40 people working 2 years. Before the biennial, it's close to 400 people. Don't forget, we are talking about Brazil. Yes, let's not talk about the last performance in Brazil and Germany, but beside this, still Brazil. Okay. So how we can talk about things that do not exist? This is the title of the biennial, that's changing here and there for different purposes. Today, I think I prefer how to fight against things that do not exist. later I will explain. I hope you can read. I'm not sure it's big enough, but this is like, oops, it's a German keyboard. Yes? Oh, Hungarian, okay. So where is the plus? How I make it bigger? Command what? Command, no. If somebody can help me, sorry. The Biennial opened in 51. And the first few years, it was in the place today, it's the MASPI. Yeah, just to make it a bit bigger, that I can control. No, okay, never mind. Never mind, because I can't read what it's written. Okay, it's founded in 51. It invited 23 countries, 1,800 works. It was the first biennial. And the approach of the biennial is to present São Paulo as a center for international art. The São Paulo Biennial, it's an elitistic project from the beginning up to today, even though that the amount of school and organization and the education still. So I will say, first, the biennial maybe need or should to educate the elite, and the approach is to educate the other visitors. And it's a long approach. I think this is what Ivo Mesquita mission, and still, it's first to work with the elite and then the rest. In 57, the biennial moved to the pavilion that we are using now. It's around 30,000 square meter. It's a huge biennial. It's in the park. The park, it's not accessible. If you don't have a car or you don't have money to pay a taxi, it takes a while to come with a bus. It's one of the things that we are dealing or trying to find a solution. Since the biennial, it's free of charge, so everybody can enter. But everybody can enter if they can pay the ride. And the ride sometimes it's quite long, and sometimes it's more than one bus. So here are some presentation. The biennial, the São Paulo Biennial, it was international, but also national presentations. It was national presentation until the 26th biennial when Lisette Guitamayo decided to change the format of the biennial. I think this is much related also the question of sponsorship. In the moment the biennial become don't have any more international presentation, national presentation. So the biennial need to look for other sources than countries. In the past it was Venice Biennial and São Paulo Biennial as the biennial that was written in the culture office or the culture ministry. Those are the biennials that we are supporting. This is changed, but it changed many other things. So this was the last biennial. I'm sorry that it's so small because this one is the floor plan, which is quite nice. This floor plan during the dictatorship time, from 65 to 85, the coup, the dictatorship, hard boycott, not one biennial, but one biennial after the other, boycotted by local and international artists. I think one of the interesting biennial under this time was the Zanini, and I think he opened the door for Lisette to change the format of the biennial, but this was during the time of the dictatorship. In the beginning, it was a lot of reaction from the international to the coup, to the dictatorship, the artists that are boycotting. Slowly, by the years, 20 years of dictatorship, nobody were interested anymore, not to the artists that are boycotting, the ones that are not participating. The army took over of the content. I think Zanini make a different exhibition. Here we can see he tried different format, like mail art and other more experimental approach to the biennial. This is the 27th biennial of Lisette. that changed the biennial to the format that we are working today, which is international platform and not national presentation. We arrived to, or we start to work more or less 1 year ago. 1 year ago, the street in São Paulo, as in Istanbul, were restless. This is also one of the reasons that we decided to stay and to live in Istanbul, the whole team. It's quite big, it's heavy on the budget. Maybe not so heavy, we are not using hotel and we are not traveling so much. So we took a few decisions. One is to stay the whole year in Brazil, to live in São Paulo, and to travel around the country. We traveled in many states, but maybe I will go for it later. Okay, here we see some presentation. One of the questions that we ask ourselves, how we can present what's happened now in Brazil and elsewhere without representing. How we can present without representing, since the model of democracy, of representation, is collapsing. And it's collapsing, it is also reflect about what we are doing. So how we can go around it, what we should do. I'm not sure that we found the answer. I'm not sure that we have it. We wrote 3 keywords for us: collectivity, conflict, imagination, and transformation. I think it's in the right order. Collectivity, more than once, create conflicts. Conflicts help sometimes for our imagination. Imagination maybe can lead to transformation. So this is the time that we arrive. This is how Paulista look at this time, demonstration. One of the things, it's the symbol that started, it was the catraca. The catraca had a meaning of control, but also counting. So you enter to the bus, it's counting. You enter to the biennial. You enter to a school. You enter to the museum. You have the catraca, the turnstile, that's counting the people, but also controlling, because not always it makes sense the place that the catraca is. It's become a symbol among artists. By the way, the images that I'm showing, it's not the images from the exhibition. I just collected to have it as a reference. So it was different performance around the catraca. Those images probably, you know. So we travel around the country from north to south, different places. Brazil is very different. And the idea was to meet people, not just to go to galleries and museums, and not only artists. So every places that we visited, we create a forum of discussion, and we invite people to local actors. The idea was to 2 main goals. One, it's to hear what people have to say, and the second, how they say it, how people converse, how people talk to each other. In different places, it's happened differently. Brazil, it's not one. And this is one of the things, the important thing that we learned. Brazil, it's very different. And the relation between São Paulo to Belém, the relation between Belém to Porto Alegre are completely different. Different discussion, different approach, different imagination or idea who they are, different identity. In this biennial will be less artists from the centers like Rio and São Paulo. It will be more artists that living in other cities. And this is a result of the research, but also maybe it's important to mention it's the first time that the São Paulo Biennial, the board choose to work with international, or one can say foreigner curators. In the past, there is one curator, a German, but they lived there for many times. He was the head of Goethe Institute that curated the biennial. But this was the first time that curators that are not living, not in Latin America, are working in the biennial. It's create different things. It creates, I think, from the art scene expectation, or they don't understand anything, they don't they don't know who we are, how they can work, they don't know the history of Brazil. And I think this has helped us a bit, because we could go, also the misunderstanding or a bit of lack of knowledge, because we could go around the galleries to places that other people will not go. We could ask questions that other people will not ask, or local people are not interested anymore or don't think that they should ask. We could give our eye with a fresh look to certain kind of phenomena, and I hope it will be shown in the Biennial. Beside the research in Brazil, we did the research in Latin America. We visit different places. So the Biennial and the rest, it will be artists that we work in the past. One or two words on the way that we work with the artist. We will have a lot of new production of local and international artists. We work in two ways which I think they are significant. One, the artists work directly with the education department, the one that do the research with the artist and for the artist. Before the artist came for a residency, were the education department. It was not easy. The education department have the system and the way how to work. To change it was an effort, it was a conflict. It took time until the department and the people in the department, the educator, were embrace the idea. But many artists worked together with the educator, and the idea was that in the end, people will come to the exhibition, they will not talk about the object there. They will talk about the process. They will talk about the experience that they have, the knowledge that they share with the artist. This was one. The other one was to, sorry, it's very hot here. The other one was to invite artists from different places and to ask them to work together. I can tell one case that's happening now. The duo artists Sandy Hilal and Alessandro Petti from Bethlehem, Bet Sahur. We invite them to work with a group of artists that called Contrafile. We find out that the practice that Sandy and Alessandro are using and Contrafile have a similarity in the practice. The context, the geopolitical context, it's different. But there is something that they can share together. And now they are the 8th. Sandy and Alessandro arrived second time to Brazil. They went all together, I think around 10 people with some guests, to Bahia to work with the Quilombo community and the Quilombo University in Bahia. The idea was to bring the campus in camps that Sandy and Alessandro initiated in Bethlehem to initiate it with the Quilombo community. I will say one thing about the Quilombo community. If one of the sentences that repeated among the Palestinians, the right of return, it's the same with the Quilombo, but them it's the return, it's not to the land, it's to return to the common. And this is Sandy and Alessandro find very appealing to their context. What does it mean to come back to the common and not to the real estate, not to the land, not to the past? It's how come back to the future. And so we have different, I wanted just to describe this case is happening now. We will see how they work, but this is one of the processes that we practice and to bring artists that we can recognize certain kind of similarities in the way they work. In parallel, I think last May, we started with the, I can say curatorial workshop, but it's more a toolbox for cultural organization. Many of the participants are from Brazil, they got a scholarship, others from Latin America, which is quite interesting. People, for me it's quite hard, I don't speak no Spanish, no Portuguese, and it's much more easy because in the class itself, the Brazilians speak Portuguese, or even for Portugal, Portuguese, and the Spanish speak Spanish. There is a long history there, and it's become interesting phenomena that each one keep his own language, both understand each other, and create like new terms. This is just something that we didn't plan, it's happened. But the idea that they will continue to work with us, We had 2 meetings. Okay, 5 minutes. I made all the way from Brazil, 11 hours flight. And I'm Jewish. And I'm working in Brazil. And we lost. Okay, so the curatorial workshop will continue. It continued during the Biennial. So how are we going to deal with what happened in Brazil? When we arrived, it was Passe Livre that brought there, or others, there is who brought million people to the street, but Passe Livre were part of the forces that brought people to the street. Then, now, it's the Copa, it's the World Cup that create a lot of resistance. The World Cup will end in 2 days. Brazil not going to be the win the sorry. Not going to win. The problem will stay. And in October are the elections. Brazil changed. Brazil changed in the last year. As a very good friend there, a cartoonist said, when the paint went out of the tube, you can't bring it back. People went to the street because they are unhappy. They didn't bring solution, but they brought the problems. And the problems are there, and the World Cup will end. I go now quick. This is part of the issue that we are dealing. It's housing, and we are going to deal to the program in time. So in parallel to the program in space that will happen in the Biennial, this will be the program in time. Will be few conferences under 4 thematic. One of them is Right to the City. This will happen in collaboration with activists from Istanbul. Since or the neoliberal city and the parallel events in time make sense that people will come together and share ideas, share methods. Today we talk already, Maria talked about uses of art and uses of institution. This will be the second topic. The third one, it's trans, or one is not enough. It's about religious, ideology, and the body. And we will have a sarao and performance which are more local activity and poetry that coming from the outskirts of São Paulo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Galit. We are looking forward to seeing your biennial. I would like to welcome Carolyn Christov-Bakargiev now for an intervention. I think we are running out of time, but she came just for this, especially for this conference. And
should I stay down?
No, please join us here.
Publicly or privately?
In every possible way, publicly and privately. I've never owned an Apple product in my life, and I've said it in many, many interviews, so publicly and privately. Okay. By the way, I came for this conference to hear everyone because it's a great pleasure after some years of retreat, after Documenta, to be back in listening to lectures and talks and to see so many friends. So I'm here as a member of the audience and enjoyed very much listening to all of you. So this 5-minute comment will become just 1 minute because we've run out of time. But I want to say I agree very much. So I'm the audience. I'm just commenting like I'm someone from the audience. I agree very much with what Gita says about the specificity of understanding the different histories and contexts in a very striated way, and understanding how also Eurocentric and European liberal thinking and judgment on other systems and spaces and histories can be extremely problematic. I very much enjoyed your presentation, Ahmet, because it was an artistic, strong expression of action. And I think it's a very important milestone in the history, actually, of thinking about the relationships between the structures and the thing that one does. So it was, of course, one has to think and compare what happened in '68, for example, in Biennale of Venice. What it brought was that the Biennale of Venice was no longer an art fair. In other words, artworks were sold until '68 in the fair. This changed after those protests and so on. So these things do have enormous effects, and we don't know what it is, so I very much enjoyed. I look forward to coming to Sao Paulo very much. And I had a whole long thing. I was going to compare an essay that I wrote in 2007 for a lecture in Thessaloniki about Biennales that Catherine David had invited me to speak at, and then was published in Janus. And basically, when I read it again, it sounded like everything that we are saying in the last days, I mean, and years, about the connection between the strange alliance between the development of global cities and the network of global cities through the tourism and the strange alliance between somehow the civil society building that Biennales were part of. For example, Gwangju is the case in point. Why it's in Gwangju is because of the history of what happened in Gwangju, and the strange alliance between that and the emergent capitalisms in the global world of financial corporate capitalism. So I wanted to compare that with our notes today, but we won't do it. But I wanted to end with something very personal. So I might seem very almost conservative in a strange way in terms of the language we use and what we do with it. So I'm going to read to you the SMS exchange that happened from 7:03 to 10:54 during 4 hours between myself and Anna Bogigian, some days before coming here. And this is how it went. So Anna wrote to me out of the blue, "I hope you are fine. I'm still in West Bengal, Shantiniketan, very hot, very difficult weather. I could not prepare much for my exhibition in Sao Paulo, but they expect that I will do more work there. But at the end, it is the quality that matters. It is very damp, wet, and humid. The world is in a bad condition, but it has always been in a bad condition. Anna." So I wrote to her, "Hello, Anna. So nice to hear from you, and sorry that it is so hot. I am in Velletri. There are so many flowers, and Darcy is happy. Cesare and his mother are here too, and they go back to Rome this evening. Chiara was here for some days to work on the book for Adrian Villarojas with me. It is almost finished. I wrote an essay about Francis Alice's work in Afghanistan for a catalogue. Do you want me to send it to you? Istanbul is also always on my mind, and I will go back in July 13. Yes, the world is in bad condition, so much pain, but also male intrigue in my view. When shall we meet? When do you want to come, if you want to? Or we can talk about the work for Istanbul on Skype or phone too. Best, Carolyn." Then I wrote her again another SMS before she replied, "Actually, there is something specific to ask you about. For a panel in Berlin, I'm going to hear next Friday about art and politics in relation to money and sponsors," which isn't really this, I understand, but that's what I thought it was about. When can I Skype with you about this? All my best, Carolyn." And she replied, "I'm going to Brazil on the 14th and will be in Cairo from the 10th midday, leaving on the 14th early in the morning. I'm actually quite ignorant on the subject, as I have had no sponsors, so I do not know if I am eligible to speak on the subject or if I know enough to talk about it. I will be in Calcutta tomorrow, Anna." And I wrote back, "It is about the fact that some artists are saying that it is necessary to boycott with exhibitions when the sponsors have companies that make products that can harm people. I think it is a good point, but also a case-by-case decision, and especially all money, when there is a lot of it, is connected with power, and there are always contradictions in acting in the field of art. In particular, I am worried about Koç Holding in Istanbul. But point is, taxes from City of Kassel financed Documenta and come from companies in Kassel who sometimes make tanks. And funds come from wine, and funds also came from wine or alcohol companies, might seem better in a first instance, but actually there are many who suffer and die from alcohol abuse. Anyway, it's kind of an obvious contradiction because also the Medici waged wars. Maybe it's a subject there is not much to add to. Carolyn. And Anna replied, there is no pure, innocent people or world. And I wrote, yes, I suppose there isn't. And she wrote, I would not consider myself pure and innocent to start with. And I wrote, yes, I suppose it must start there, from the self. But there are differences. Some people kill babies. And she wrote, but to kill an insect is to kill. It depends on the definition of life and the right to life. I'm going to Calcutta tomorrow. I am in Shantiniketan. On the 14th, I fly to Brazil via Cairo, where I fly from Mumbai. There I return to Cairo, and on November 28th, we will have a show with Andre in Beirut, unless a war is declared. Anna.
Thank you very much, Carolyn, for this poetic intervention. I don't know if we have time for questions. I see Christina making a note, but at least do we have time just to take questions, and maybe we can one or two? There is another event. At least, yeah. Just before we finish, I give the floor to Galit back because she didn't have enough time.
Ahmet, I want to ask you something. It's something that I'm concerned, I think many people concerned. It's the question of the boycott, or cherem, or haram, which is closer to our culture, more maybe to understand it. You said that you are against boycott before. You say for negotiation. Did I understand you correctly? Or what you see, I will ask it differently, what do you see the benefit of boycott?
Look, I just said I'm against the easy use of word boycott. And when you use the word boycott or when you boycott, usually you are outside of something. And this damage, it won't damage you when you boycott, when you're outside of something. What happened to us in Sydney, actually, we were very much damaged emotionally and a lot of like planning all year for a project or for something. It was a huge amount of damage and emotionally, and like incredible. So we were first damaged, but why we are the only ones who are damaged and have to just be silent about it? We just have to find a way out, right? There was actually a big physical pain. Why? Yeah, that's Sydney. You mean
like South Africa? It was very useful. The boycott was very useful.
I think boycott, it's not boycott. We should use the word campaign, please. Campaign is different than propaganda as well. We were discussing, there was no time. Boycott, propaganda, these are different words. We should not even waste our time discussing what they mean and what they could do. We should discuss why one has to withdraw, and also how a campaign can form from within and sometimes from outside, as the members or people took part of something maybe even in the past, not right now. Like once you are part of something, like I think responsibility just not disappear in the air. Like I always feel responsible towards Istanbul. Like even if I try to stay away from something, like there's something happening in Istanbul, I know I won't be able to somehow. Like I'm responsible. I can withdraw from maybe citizenship, but still I want to get back to there. I'm responsible, and it's different to your own local context. It's different to another context, and it's always case by case. We just have to give you enough time to study cases, and I think the most important thing and the most important word, maybe from our culture, has to be understood in other cultures as well, same way. Being sincere. Maybe we have to bring in the art world, being sincere when organizing events like biennials that are actually bringing in new models and challenging the existing structures. The moment I feel like I'm not challenging anymore, I'm just like a harmless, institutionalized criticism kind of person, I would stop, I mean, literally. But, and some people, a lot of people do that, and they stop. They go to other fields, maybe they become carpenters. They can choose another profession. So that is, yeah.
It's just a comment that you speak about pain, the pain that you went through in the campaign. There's a lot of pain in the world. I mean, the martyrhood of an artist or a group of artists cannot be necessarily in balance, symmetrical balance to the pain in the world. I mean, it seems too much of martyrhood here. Too much of martyrhood, shaheed. This is a kind of shaheed discourse, and I find that, you know, I think there has to be some balance in the kind of martyrhood within an art institution, addressing itself to political issues in a country, not your own, or maybe your own as well, and the kind of injustice and inequality in the rest of the world. I think we must be symmetrical somewhere. This is looking asymmetrical to me.
The final debate is starting, but we don't have time for it. We can't.
Important. So maybe they will have to chase us all out because I'll continue talking. Carolyn also talked for a long time. So I really think that talking about sponsorship and boycott and so on, I just want to give one key word: cleansing process. How many times money has to be laundered and cleaned in order to be acceptable?
Yeah.
So I think someone at some point said that as soon as there is a certain quantity, amount of money around, it's necessarily dirty, and that's true.
That's what I wrote to Anna.
Yeah, but so still, it's not about being clean.
That has to.
It's about the circle. You say
there.
that is the important part. How we can reverse that loop, right? That loop is there. How we can reverse it, and how we can still stand there and try to reverse it. I think
it's about broader things as well. But what Gita brings up is essential, and we have to remember that there's a, that the poets have betrayed the world. You know, that Brecht says that is a feeling that people have now, that this artistic, even elite within the activist artistic elite, is somehow distant from not just people and babies. I mean, the non-human as well. I mean, for me, that's very important, as everyone knows.
Thank you.
Not just the human.
I mean, I get this. I get this.
You have to be the bad guy.
I have to be the bad girl, and because there are people waiting outside, and there is another event in this hall. But I mean, this event showed once again that this debate on institutional critique is very crucial. So one of the objectives of the Biennial Association would be to foster this kind of debate and discussions also in the future. So, and we will be continuing this discussion after we leave this hall. We can continue, hopefully, outside. Thank you very much for your patience. Thank you.